There we go. And we are recording. All right. Our guest today is Mr. Bob Morrison. I will tell you, 2 years ago, I probably did not know this name. And as I've got to meet this man for the last 2 years, I will just be incredibly biased to say, if I need to find out what's going on, if I need to ask a question, if I need to find some history to something, if I need to find somebody that can tell me about policy and governmental things that are going with the arts, this is a man that is one email or one phone call away and is very kind and gracious with his time and will always help out. And so I've asked him today to please talk with us about social emotional learning. And my reasoning for doing this is Bob explained things so that they're understandable. And I'm going to just be very point blank about that, because right now, when I travel throughout the state, we have a lot of variations, a lot of definitions, and just frankly, just a lot of buzzword. And so I want to hear straight from Bob, and I think you will enjoy what he has to present. So Bob, it's all yours, and you can take over the screen.
Great, thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be here with you today. So we got a lot of road that we're going to cover as it relates to our topic, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. And then I'll also share with you a session that's coming up next week that's very much related to this particular topic. But obviously, we've all been impacted as a result of COVID-19. There's not anywhere on the planet that hasn't been impacted, anyone on the planet that hasn't been impacted. And it certainly has had, you know, a significant impact on our education system, on our arts education programs, and most importantly, on the lives of our students. Now, when I first was involved and first started really speaking out about what was going on with COVID-19, I talked about the fact that I likened the crisis to a two-headed monster. The first head was a public health crisis. So that's obviously the spread of COVID-19 and everything that comes along with that. Then the other head is the fiscal crisis. That was the impact on the economy, the closing of businesses, the loss of jobs, food insecurity, and other things that were created along with that. But along the way, over the summer, the darn thing grew a third head. And the third head is the mental health crisis. And it is that head that we're really going to talk about today, which is why I talk about, well, where do we go from here? So in the way that we need to focus on addressing the mental health crisis is recognizing one truth that I think is accurate for just about every school administrator across the United States, and certainly most school administrators in your state. And that is that the social emotional learning and well-being of our students are going to be front and center as we begin to roll our way back into schools. You know, as we find our way to reopening schools in some places for the remainder of this year, but in particular as it relates to next year, you know, where, you know, hopefully we will be, you know, breaking free of some of the shackles that have been placed upon our schools and upon our programs, and that we're entering back into some sort of new reality that is, you know, based on, you know, coming out of the COVID-19 lockdowns. But social emotional learning has got to be the top priority for our students. And this is important because this is a place where arts education can play a very important role. So we're going to talk about social emotional learning, its connection to arts education, how we can do it in a meaningful way so that it has a positive impact on our students. We'll talk a little bit of the connection to around SEL and diversity, equity, inclusion, and then also spend a little bit of time talking about some of the challenges of return to school and why we need to make sure that SEL is the focus as we move forward. So what is it? What is social emotional learning? It's the process through which children and adults acquire and apply the knowledge and skills and attitudes necessary to develop healthy identities, their self-awareness, understand and manage emotions, or self-management, achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, or social awareness, and then relationship skills, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and be able to make responsible and caring decisions, or responsible decision making. So we break this down into kind of three major buckets. The first is self. The second is others. So in self, self-awareness, self-management. Others is social awareness. How are you engaging with others? Relationship skills. How do you manage your relations with others? And then making responsible decisions. So that is kind of the structure around which social emotional learning is organized. And one of the best reports regarding this is a report called From a Nation at Risk to a Nation at Hope. It was released by the Aspen Institute, I think 3.5 years ago. And this report really laid out a series of recommendations regarding social, emotional, and academic development. And it had involved the leading thinkers in education and social emotional learning at the time. And what I want to call your attention to is the third recommendation that they said was to change instruction to teach students social, emotional, and cognitive skills, right? Teach the skills, embed these skills in academics and school-wide practice. The whole idea is to embed the skills. And I think that's the thing that I want you to take away is that we want to intentionally teach specific skills and competencies across the academic content in all areas of learning. And that is true for the arts. We want to embed these skills in the arts. So another report came out not quite 2 years ago. It was in June of 2019 from Ingenuity and the University of Chicago, called Arts Education and Social Emotional Learning Outcomes Among K-12 Students. And this was basically laying out a theory of action. So this was a theoretical framework for the connection between arts education and social emotional learning. And within that framework, it was citing research, a research study in particular called Foundations for Young Adult Success, a developmental framework. And in this research framework, it stated that developmental experiences plus developmental relationships were the cornerstones of young adult success. These were the foundational elements for young adult success. And it went further to kind of outline what the action, a series of action and reflection sequences that they felt helped embody that. And so when you look at it, you see the action sequence of encounter, tinker, choose, practice, contribute, and reflection, describe, evaluate, connect, envision, integrate. Well, I don't know about you, but even though this had nothing to do with the arts, when I see this, that's what I see. You know, that's how I relate to it, because we do all these things in our artistic practices with our students, either on the action side or the reflection side. So I think that that was really a real epiphany for me to recognize that this research that had nothing to do with arts was talking about the foundational elements of young adult success. And then they talk about the action and reflection sequences, and they just, sing out to me arts education. So,
Bob, I want to interrupt you a second. Would you go back a slide?
I will.
And one of the things that's so crucial about this is when we say that's kind of what we do in the arts. We didn't just start it yesterday, but the other word is it's embedded. We can't hardly do the arts and not do it because it's a part of what we do. You didn't have to make extra effort to make it happen. It's how you're making the arts happen. So go ahead. I just wanted to make sure to add that embed word in.
No, absolutely. And you'll see as we go on how important that word is going to be to being successful with social emotional learning. So why may arts educators have an advantage with developmental relationships? Well, the reason why we do is simple. We see the students more often and for a greater period of time than any other teacher. Think about an art teacher or a music teacher at an elementary school, right? They see the students when they come in at kindergarten, and they see them all the way through 5th grade until they leave the building. Whereas at grade level, they're seeing one teacher at 1st grade, and then the 1st grade teacher passes that group of kids on to the 2nd grade teacher, and they get a new batch of kids. The music teacher, the art teacher, they have those kids the entire time they're in the building. So we have a structural advantage to being able to develop these developmental relationships with our students just because we see them more frequently and over a sustained period of time than just about anyone else in the building. So why may arts educators have an advantage with developmental experiences? Well, again, that's kind of our wheelhouse, right? Because arts education by its very nature is social. If we look at our arts classrooms, whether we're looking at, the painting studio or a dance performance or a music class or a theatrical production, the artistic process in most instances by its very nature is a social entity. And certainly in public schools, arts education activities are social. It's how students define themselves. It's their peer group. That's why they're hanging out for lunch in the theater room, or they're hanging out in the band room, or they want to get a pass from study hall so they can go hang out, down in the arts room, so they can be with their friends. They can be with their tribe, in essence. So the arts by their very nature are social, but arts education is emotional, right? And I know it sounds a little kind of trite that, oh yeah, arts are social, arts are emotional, but it's true. And just think of it from the standpoint of, you look at a painting, right? When you look at a painting, it will evoke a response. It will evoke an emotional response. And I'm not saying that it's always going to be a positive response, but it will evoke some sort of emotional response when you look at it. Sometimes even if it's just, huh? Right? That in and of itself is a response. And I would argue that music does the same thing.
Just confirming, we've lost audio and video right now.
Really? The audio didn't show? I'll fix that. I'm going to try this again.
Phyllis, it was black, but I think he was setting something up or presenting something.
Yeah, if the sound wasn't there, I'll fix it. We'll get it fixed. Hang on 1 second. And let me get the right spot. Very sorry about that. Let's try it again. And the emotion that's involved in the music. And then when you pair it with the photograph of the girl in the red jacket, it just brings it all together. And I accidentally made my own point, because in the silence, that really doesn't evoke an emotional response. But as you can see with music, with the combination with the visual, it certainly does. And if you question whether or not our social emotional learning and arts education and the connection between the two is really something that people are taking seriously, just think about it in terms of all of the national arts education organizations. When they came together last spring to put out their statement about the importance of arts education, they led with arts education supports the social emotional well-being of students, whether through distance learning or in person. So this has been an emerging area of really being able to articulate the connection between arts education and social emotional learning. But in order for it to be effective, right, in order to really to have the kind of intentional impact on our students, it has to be embedded, right? Just like Roger was saying, it has to be embedded in what we do. But it's not just that it has to be embedded, it has to be intentional, right? So the approach to it has to be that in working with it, that you are intentionally trying to activate the social emotional learning aspects of a particular lesson that you are working on. And it has to be sustained. And it can't just be something that you do every once in a while and then you move on to something else. And it's not a bolt-on program where it's like, okay, I'm teaching music, stop, social emotional learning, and then back to music. It needs to be woven into what you do. When done right, what you are doing is teaching your artistic discipline. It's no different than teaching your artistic discipline, but you're doing so through the lens of recognizing that the arts have the power to ignite these social emotional learning connections with our students. And by being intentional about it is the way that it's going to be most effective. So how do we do that? How do we embed social emotional learning into arts education? And so this was a challenge that we took on in New Jersey over 2 years ago. In our state, we have those 5 competencies that we talked about: self, others, and responsible decisions. And within those competencies, there are 19 sub-competencies. So within self-awareness, you see there are 4 sub-competencies that they kind of identified. So we looked at those and go, okay, well, if this is the framework for social emotional learning, we also know that we have our framework for arts education, our art standards, where we've got our artistic processes of creating, performing, responding, connecting. And within those, we have our 11 anchor standards, right? So we've got our artistic processes, and we've got our social emotional learning competencies and sub-competencies. And we got together and came up with the very technical idea that we were going to mush them together. And mushing them together, kind of like where with this Reese's peanut butter cup, where the arts education is the chocolate and the SEL is the peanut butter. And we put them together to create a matrix to identify and explore every single intersection between the 11 anchor standards and the 19 sub-competencies. And we had groups of experts from arts education and social emotional learning working in interdisciplinary teams to address each of these intersections and to debate and discuss, you know, what are the connections? Is there a connection? How do we articulate it? What might it look like? And I don't expect you to be able to read this. This is just to be able to show you the 200 plus intersections that exist in this area. So here's an example of one of the intersections between creating and self-awareness. And what we ended up doing is we created a new series of enduring understandings and essential questions, just like we have with the art standards, but did them from the lens of incorporating social emotional learning sub-competencies. And so for all of these intersections, we came up with a new set of EUs and EQs to assist educators in the development of curriculum. And so this is what it looks like. This is the entire matrix spread out. Again, I don't expect you to be able to read it, and that's not the point, but it is for you to highlight where all of these intersections are and how they were articulated. So then we